Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Mind Movement Health podcast. I am super excited about our show today. We have a special guest on the show. BJ, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me here, Kate. I'm excited to get chatting to you.
Well, I always love diving into nutrition, and I know you're known as the Autoimmunity Nutritionist. And autoimmunity is one of those things that I think, has really, there's a lot more people with different autoimmune conditions. It's being talked about a lot more, but I still think there's maybe a lot of misinformation out there, or maybe people don't know a lot of information about it. So I'm super excited to have you on the show.
Yeah, I remember when I was studying it in the early 2000s, and when I told people that I was studying autoimmune disease, no one had heard of it. So it is good that it's getting more recognition, and I know there is celebrities and other people that are coming out and sharing their experience of living with these conditions. So I'm glad it's going a bit more mainstream now, and hopefully there'll be more research into the conditions as a result of that as well.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll dive into that a little bit later on in the podcast. But before we do, can you please just give a brief introduction of yourself to our listeners?
Yeah, so I am a registered nutritionist. I'm based here in the UK. I have a functional medicine practice where I'm working with people all over the world, and I'm helping people who have different autoimmune conditions from alopecia areata to arthritis, skin issues like psoriasis, and even conditions like multiple sclerosis. So I'm helping them with diet and lifestyle changes to really improve their health and hopefully reverse their symptoms. The reason that I got into this is because I was diagnosed with alopecia areata when I was 7 years old. I then experienced hair loss for 25 years. I developed psoriasis as a teenager, and again, I lived with that for nearly 20 years. And in my late teens, I developed a lot of, I had a lot of symptoms of fatigue. I had joint issues. I mean, with these conditions, you get a diagnosis, but you have joint issues and fatigue and lots of different skin issues outside of the psoriasis. So there was lots of other things going on. And it took almost 12 years to be finally diagnosed with post-viral chronic fatigue syndrome. So I was living with fatigue throughout my 20s. It's a complete blur. After studying autoimmune disease and immunology and biochemistry at university, I actually went on, I went to Australia and just had a different perspective on life, I think, after being there for a year, and came back and became a chartered accountant and decided I wanted to work in the corporate world. And I did that throughout my 20s and into my 30s as well. But I, at that point, was having a lot of fatigue. So, my life was really working. I would exercise when I could. I would socialize when I could. But for the most time, I was crashing on the sofa and just trying to be as awake as I possibly could be. So getting the diagnosis was helpful in my early 30s, but unfortunately there wasn't much they could do to help me. I was still experiencing all the other autoimmune symptoms as well, but then I discovered functional medicine. Then I went to a session at a college in London that was offering nutrition training, and I realized this is what I want to do. So whilst working as a chartered accountant, I then studied nutrition, and it was great because I could put my science knowledge from the past into practice. And that's what I do now. And I set up my clinic, and yeah, I absolutely love what I do. I transformed my own health as well during this process. And I've now been symptom free from all those autoimmune symptoms and my fatigue for over 9 years. And it's just been completely life changing.
That's amazing. And, your sort of daily life, I'm sure you're sort of describing what a lot of people are dealing with, that they're going to work and they're constantly tired and they think that there's maybe something wrong, but no one's really worked out what it is. And so they just keep on soldiering on thinking, well, this is it, there's not much I can do.
Yeah, I honestly, when I look back, I don't think I realized how ill I was. There was a time at work when I stood up, it was after lunch, and I felt so dizzy that I knew that I was about to faint. Anybody that's fainted before, your kind of hearing goes, your vision goes. And I got to the end of the office and I just grabbed somebody that I knew and I said, I'm really, I'm not in a good way. And I had to go like sit in the stairwell. and really just put like my head between my legs to get the blood rushing to my head. And I remember thinking, yeah, it's just one of those things. I didn't think, actually, you probably should get that looked into, because you just get so used to these weird symptoms and you just think it's you. You don't think there's anything wrong. And I had been to the doctor several times when I had my joint issues. I had tendonitis. I could hardly pick things up. It was painful typing. But I didn't get a diagnosis, and it was just like, oh, here's a cream to put on. You know, for most of my autoimmune conditions, I've been given creams, like steroid creams, for most of the things. And it just didn't feel right to be doing it topically. I kind of knew it was something inside. But you push on, you just get up in the morning, you feel so tired, like getting out of bed. And honestly, it was just a fight all the time. But I don't think I realized how much of a fight it was until now, when I'm in my 40s now, and I've actually got more energy than I had at 25. So, there was definitely a lot going on back then.
Mm.
And I always thought when I went to the doctors, it was, you're working too long hours, or you're not, you're training too much, or there would always be an excuse. But I do all those things now, and I don't have fatigue, so I know it was a real thing. And I think that is for anybody who's living in this way, the first step is to acknowledge it and to understand, what are the symptoms you're experiencing on a daily basis? How are you feeling on a daily basis? Is life feeling hard? And then just having that self-awareness. And that's really the beginning point. And that's certainly where I started when I was improving my own health. And I see that with my clients as well.
Mm. And I guess too, finding a professional that you can work with that is going to listen to your symptoms. And then if they are not sure what is going on, they're able to refer you off to the right person.
Yeah, and that was something that I was very lucky to, I came across this amazing nutritionist. It's when I went to the college that I studied at, which is the Institute for Optimum Nutrition in London. And Christine Bailey was doing a presentation on Eat to Beat Cancer, because I had a friend who had just been diagnosed with breast cancer in her early 30s. And it was, I don't know, I just found it was the first time somebody close to me had been diagnosed with cancer. So I just felt like I wanted to do as much as I could for her. So I went to this session, and I came across this amazing nutritionist. And I couldn't believe how much knowledge she had. And, it was all based on science and her practical advice. I went away from that, and I was able to help my friend, but at the same time, I took loads away from it as well. And that's when I decided I needed help, and I really wanted Christine to help me. So I managed to get an appointment with her eventually, and we started working together. And that was really my first step into seeing how much nutrition can help. I'd actually done some work with a nutritionist in my early 20s, but it was before I went traveling, and I had seen some results by doing that. But I think in my early 30s, understanding kind of functional medicine principles and things that Christine was advocating for and helping me with made such a difference. So that was the starting point. And yeah, her guidance around testing and around the foods I should be eating, it was things that I'd never really thought of before, even though most people would have said I was fairly health conscious. And I was health conscious because I had to be. I couldn't eat certain foods without having a huge reaction. I mean, that was the other thing that I was living with, like constant reactions to foods and gut issues. And that's, yeah, I see that a lot as well with clients who have autoimmune conditions. But I think guidance helps so much. First, I believe that self-awareness piece of knowing you need the help, and then working with a nutritionist can really help you, or a health professional, or health coach as well, especially if you find it hard to stay on track with things.
Mm. And before we dive into the gut, because I think that's obviously a big role, how does, an autoimmune condition sort of develop? Is it slowly over time? Is there a number of factors? Is there factors that are outside our control, and obviously some factors that maybe are inside our control as well?
Yeah, we talk about there being three stages to an autoimmune condition. So most of the time, it is a gradual process, and it starts with autoantibodies. So antibodies which are targeting self-tissue. So for example, with alopecia areata, you would have a antibody which is attacking your hair follicle, and that causes the hair to come out. So ordinarily, with a lot of autoimmune conditions, you will have these autoantibodies present initially. Then what can happen is there are the autoantibodies, so these antibodies that are kind of in the bloodstream, but suddenly there's inflammation, and that can come from a stressful event. It could come from high blood sugar and eating lots of processed foods. It could come from bacterial or viral overload, or having an infection. It could come from toxicity, like mold toxicity. So there's lots of different environmental factors that can trigger that. And there is an argument to say they can cause those autoantibodies to be present as well. And there is an underlying genetic susceptibility with a lot of autoimmune conditions too. So it's not that there's going to be one gene that tells you you're going to get an autoimmune condition, but it's normally a cluster of different genes. So for example, in my family, my brother's got multiple sclerosis. I've had family members with sarcoidosis. I've had other family members with Hashimoto's. So we have autoimmune disease in our family. But it's not just one autoimmune disease, but it does seem that there is this genetic susceptibility there. So you have that inflammatory response happening, which can be, due to several reasons. And then the other area that can contribute to it's almost like the straw that broke the camel's back, is when there's a breakdown in a barrier. So we have these biological barriers that are almost like the security guards, and they're stopping things getting into the bloodstream. And the one that people know most about is the gut, and a lot of people refer to it as leaky gut or increased intestinal permeability, where the gaps in the digestive wall become larger, and suddenly those imbalances in the gut, or it could be toxins or other things, are released into the bloodstream, and that can then fire up an inflammatory response. And it's something that I'm really interested in, the barriers, because I see it so often in my clinic. Though it can be the gut barrier, you've also got a barrier in your lungs, you've got a barrier in your brain, you've got barriers in different parts of the body. And once they're broken down, one of the more obvious one is the barrier of your skin, and we see that breaking down with things like eczema and psoriasis. So it's not just thinking about the immune response, but how do we strengthen those barrier functions as well? So it can be a mix of different things, but I would say for most people it develops over a long period of time. And that's why one of the first things I do when I'm working with a client is we'll go through their timeline. So starting from birth or even before birth, and understanding how this might have built up over time. And it can be something that happened 20 years ago that could have been that first impact, had that initial impact in your body, and that then led to the development of something going on in the gut, like bacterial overgrowth, and then suddenly you have a stressful event, and then you have a breakdown in the barrier, and this can all happen over a period of time. So it is worth doing that, like mapping out when your symptoms started, what was going on at the time. And it's not just about the food you're eating, it's about your environment, major life changes. All those things are really important.
So as we kind of always say, talking about like our healthy habits of getting good sleep and managing our stress and, eating well, all of these things, really do help when it comes to our overall health.
Yeah, I mean, they're huge, and I think they're so easily overlooked. And I sometimes am guilty of that when I'm working with a client. I want to kind of dig into the complexities. And then when I'm talking to them, and I'll ask them about sleep, and it's like, oh, well, I'm getting 5 hours sleep a night. And like, okay, all right, we need to like start there. Or they're overtraining. I work with a lot of clients who go above and beyond in so many things in their life, and they want to do it all. And there's a lot of pressure around that as well. So a lot of my clients, it's talking about sleep and relaxation and recovery, because they're the things that are missing in their lives, but they're so fundamental. And if you are stressed, if you're not getting enough sleep, if you're not looking after your body in the right way, it's going to be quite hard to move forward or really get to a point where you're making meaningful changes. Diet can do a lot when your body is in a calm state, but when it's more stressed, you have to do a lot more, and you need a lot more nutrients and a lot more. There's only so much you can do with diet alone. There's so much more to it than that.
Well, that comes back to that sort of functional medicine, holistic health side, everything affecting one another. It all works together at the end of the day. And I know from some of the research that I've done into autoimmunity that it really does affect women more so than men. So, can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, it's a really interesting that so many more women have these types of conditions. And the research still doesn't give us that much of an insight into why this is the case. There is the possibility that we have different chromosomes to men, so we actually have more genes associated with the immune system, which might mean that our immune systems are more sensitive. And with an autoimmune condition, your immune system is a little bit more sensitive to issues going on in the body. There's a few mechanisms involved in that, but what it means is your immune system's more heightened, so it's more likely to have that autoimmune response. The other thing is the change in hormones, and I certainly saw that in my own health because men don't have the same transitions when it comes to their hormones. We have puberty and then menopause, perimenopause. And I certainly noticed my psoriasis started flaring when I was going through puberty. And I find a lot of clients who are going through perimenopause and menopause will start with symptoms and they may receive an autoimmune diagnosis. And it can be quite hard to determine whether it's related to menopause or whether it's related to an autoimmune conditions, because some of the symptoms really overlap. So the change in our hormones, estrogen is anti-inflammatory in nature. We've got progesterone, which really helps to calm the nervous system. So when those become lower and you're more reliant on your adrenal glands and your adrenal health, which for the most part has been serving you for your stress response, but hasn't really had to take that role until perimenopause and menopause, that can be a factor too. And then the other potential reason is that women take on a lot of responsibility. So they are ordinarily the carers, they're looking after children, they're looking after elderly parents. They are working hard in their careers, especially around 30s and 40s, might be getting into kind of senior roles. And so I know men take on a lot in other ways, but it could be that women are just doing too much at that particular time in life and not looking after themselves as well. I think that's the key part, is that they're taking on a lot, which is great in some respect. It's great for women to have careers and to be looking after their children and helping and supporting their family. But what I find is that they do that rather than looking after themselves. They're not number one priority. They're normally like 5 priorities down the line. Whereas I feel, this is just my experience, is that men are more likely to take my advice and just think, actually, I do need to make these changes for myself and really, really do them. Whereas I feel like some female clients that I'm working with find it a bit harder because they are focused on looking after their children. I work a lot with mothers who are looking after their children, and there's no one more motivated, mothers and fathers, than parents when it comes to health. They are the most motivated clients I've got. They're obviously helping their children, but it just shows that a lot of us are more inclined to want to help other people rather than helping ourselves. And it takes time to think about it in a different light. If you are looking after yourself and you're putting yourself first, you're going to have more to give to other people. And that's the way I explain it when people are more that way inclined. So they're the common theories around why it affects more women than men. But I think there's still more research needed into that area to understand it better.
Well, I think it's a kind of a fascinating area, and how you were saying with the changes with the hormones, if there is, do they know within the research that if somebody is going to go on HRT and stuff, does it affect then their symptoms with their, autoimmune condition, or does it have any effect on maybe lowering their risk of a chance of developing an autoimmune condition?
I wish I had a straight answer for you, Kate, but I don't on this one, because the truth is it's highly personalized. So somebody might do really well with HRT, especially if their estrogen is low. Somebody might be in an estrogen dominant state, even though their estrogen is lower. Their progesterone is so low that they have this imbalance. So it's almost like having a lot of estrogen, even though you have low estrogen. They might not do as well because it's just like making the balance even greater. And some autoimmune conditions do better with higher estrogen. Some autoimmune conditions do better with lower estrogen. And there's a balance in the immune system between almost like an inflammatory response and an allergic response, and it's getting the balance between the immune system as well. So for the most part, it's about balance rather than you need to have more estrogen or you need to have more progesterone. It's about the balance of the hormones, and it's about your individual baseline as well. So everybody will be different. For some people, it could be beneficial. For other people, it might not be. It might just be a neutral. And then for other people, it might make things worse. So it really depends on your baseline. And I use a test in my clinic called the Dutch Plus test, and it's a dry urine test, and it gives you some great insight into your estrogen and progesterone balance, your testosterone levels, because testosterone is really important as well, and that often gets overlooked for women. And also it looks at the way that you detox these hormones, which is so key. A lot of people think about hormones and they're thinking about the endocrine glands, but the truth is it's just as much about your liver and how you are detoxing these hormones out of the body. So on this test, it will look at the metabolites that your body turns these hormones into as part of detoxification. And these metabolites are actually really active in the body. And there is research behind certain estrogen metabolites and the effect that they have on DNA and potentially linked to cancer as well. So it's really good information to have. Plus, it also looks at your stress response, because if your stress response is out in any way, either high cortisol or low cortisol, or low DHEA, or different factors that could be affecting your stress response, that has a knock-on effect to your sex hormones too. So it's great to get that kind of full picture. And then you know what your baseline is. You can work with your doctors as well, and you're best to work with your doctors as well on this, to get a picture from them as well about your hormonal health. But this really helps to understand, okay, this is your baseline. This is probably why this wasn't helpful for you, or this is why it's been working so well for you. And I see mixed results. I have clients come in and they're on HRT and they've never felt better, and then other clients it hasn't really helped them, and for some clients unfortunately it's made things worse. So again, it just depends where you currently stand in terms of your hormones and your stress levels.
And is the Dutch test sort of a standard test that if people listening in go, oh, that sounds like a good idea, if I go off to my doctor and I ask for that, it's going to be something that they can get access to?
Unfortunately, the Dutch test is not something that is recognized as much through conventional medicine. If you are working with a functional medicine practitioner, and you can go onto the Institute of Functional Medicine's website and find functional medicine practitioners on there, or working with a registered nutritionist, you will be able to access that type of testing through them. And you can have a look. I really like the Dutch website. There's lots of information on there, so you can find out more about the testing. I offer it myself if anybody's got any questions. But it's one of the tests that I use routinely in my practice, and I find it really helpful. And I've seen some really good results with it as well.
Well, I know I've had a few different sort of functional medicine practitioners on the podcast, and a few have mentioned the Dutch test before. So it is something that keeps, coming up, especially for around women and hormonal changes.
Yeah, I mean, I have a doctor based near me. We know each other quite well, and she'll often refer her clients to me to do the Dutch test. So she believes in it, but it's not part of her practice at the moment, because there is more research needed with a lot of these functional type tests. There is research behind them, but there is more research needed for them to be then, integrated into conventional medicine.
Mm. all just takes time, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And a lot, like 20 years of research is required for most things in conventional medicine. And that's a good thing in some ways, but it does slow down the process.
Mm. And when it comes to the role of the gut with, autoimmune conditions, how big a part does it play? And if somebody does have an autoimmune condition, what are some of the practices they could be doing to help support their gut?
For me, in my practice, and based on the research, the gut is so central. It's not always the only thing, but it seems to be the case with at least 90% of my clients that it is a core area that is out of sync. And there can be many reasons for that. But some of the things that I see in respect of gut health is, as I mentioned, increased intestinal permeability. So there are imbalances in the gut, and that's letting through particles, undigested food, and other toxins into the bloodstream, and that can fire up an inflammatory response. So that's part of it. But I run a lot of stool testing with my clients. So it's great because I get all this insight from lots of different people who have an autoimmune condition, and I see patterns. And often what I'll see is either issues with protein or fat digestion, which is ordinarily linked to low stomach acid, or it can be linked to liver and gallbladder function, which can be an issue as people get into their 40s and 50s. That's so key because protein is the building block of your immune system. It's the building block of most of your body, to be honest. So if you're not digesting protein well, that can have a knock-on effect. I certainly see that with clients with alopecia as well. Fat digestion is absolutely key. Our cells are made of fat. Our brain is made of fat. And not only that, there are some key nutrients like vitamin A, vitamin E, vitamin K. They're all fat soluble. We need to be able to digest our fat to be able to digest a lot of these key vitamins as well. And so that's something that I see a lot. I also see a buildup of bacteria that shouldn't be in the gut, and dysbiosis. So dysbiosis is when you have an imbalance of gut bacteria. So it can be what we call commensal gut bacteria. So bacteria you'd expect to find in the gut, and they can be imbalanced. So they should be there, but they're just out. They all have different roles to play. And when they're imbalanced, it can create inflammation. It can create issues with digestion. It can create leaky gut. So that can be an issue. But then we have these additional bacteria that can become potential pathogens. And they have linked in the research that certain bacteria like Klebsiella, Citrobacter, Enterobacter, these are bacteria that you would only expect to find growing in small amounts in the gut. And for example, there's lots of research around Klebsiella, which is a bacteria which I find a lot with clients who have arthritis. And there is research to show that for some people who have a genetic susceptibility, when they have Klebsiella in the gut, it can cause cross-reactivity in the body, which means that your immune system starts firing up against this bacteria called Klebsiella, but then it also starts firing up against the joint, and that can cause something called ankylosing spondylitis, which is an autoimmune condition. So there is research behind that, and I see that a lot with clients. They have a buildup of this bacteria. It could potentially be causing this autoimmune response. And I know in my own health, I did a stool test many years ago, and I had a long list of these additional bacteria, and actually did one in December, and I had a tiny amount of growth of Streptococcus, which is at the back of the throat. And just having like a very small growth of it isn't unusual. Everything else had gone. And, if there's one, I'm sure there's several reasons why I've stayed free of my autoimmune symptoms, but I really believe that that's part of it because of the effect of these bacteria. And then the other thing that I will see is a parasite. So sometimes if my client's immune system is fairly suppressed in the gut, they are going to be more prone to parasites. So it's either going to give me an indication that they're immune suppressed, which people might think is quite strange when you have an autoimmune condition, because isn't that your immune system being in hyperdrive? But the truth is, a lot of the time it's your immune system, especially that first line of defense, being suppressed. And then you have these growth of additional bacteria, you have growth of candida. Sorry, that's another one that I see quite largely, candida. and viruses, because your body is allowing them to seep into your body, and they can lay latent in your cells and cause these more chronic symptoms. So often I find a lot of people with autoimmune disease have quite a suppressed immune system when it comes to that first line of defense. And then there's a different part of the immune system, which is more related to the autoimmune response, the adaptive immune system. So that can often be an issue for people. That's the kind of hyperdrive part of it. So I see a lot of this when it comes to working with clients with autoimmune conditions and issues with their gut health. And there is lots you can do about it. It is helpful to understand what is going on in your gut, but just generally working on that barrier function is really the first area I would focus on. And a couple of easy things that you can do around that is to be having bone broth or collagen. It provides you with amino acids like glycine and glutamine, which are really important for that gut barrier function to help close those tight junctions. So having either collagen or bone broth every day can be helpful for that. When it comes to an easy food that you can start including, stewed apples release something called pectin. It has to be stewed apples with the skin on. It produces something called pectin. And if you have a couple of spoonfuls of that every day, it feeds the beneficial bacteria to produce something called short chain fatty acids. Again, these are really important when it comes to your immune response in the gut with food, making sure your body is more tolerant to food, so you don't have many food reactions. It helps with the energy system in the gut, and they're produced when you eat resistant starch, so things like pectin, which is found in stewed apples. So having that every day can really help. So there are two things that are quite easy to incorporate into your life on a routine basis. And then I'll just mention one more thing, is the stress response, because we have a nerve between our brain and our gut called the vagus nerve. And what I find is when people don't have a high vagal tone, or they're doing shallow breathing, their immune system is in fight or flight, it's going to be hard to be helping your gut health, because when your body's in fight or flight, you are in a state of, well, your body thinks you're running away from a predator, so it's not prioritizing digestion. So helping with your vagal tone, calming the nervous system can really go a long way, and that can really help your gut health as well. But there are lots of different things you can do dependent on what your baseline is as well, and understanding your symptoms can be the first start to that, because one of the questions I'll often ask is, do you have any gut symptoms? And I certainly was like this as well. I was like, no, absolutely fine. There's no issue there. And then I'll ask, well, do you get bloating? Oh yeah, I get bloating every day. But people don't realize that you shouldn't be getting bloated every day. That is something that probably needs to be addressed, and they might have pain or reflux or things that they don't realize is linked to their digestion. And it can be a sign of imbalances in the gut.
Wow, you touched on so many things there. I want to dive into when you were talking about the bacteria. Are there certain foods that people can think about maybe that will feed some of those good bacteria, and then the other foods that may be feeding the bad bacteria that they can look at avoiding as well?
Yeah, definitely. So in terms of the foods to avoid, I mean, high sugar food, but these bacteria and candida, which is a yeast, which can also be problematic, they love sugar. So the more sugar you eat, the more you are going to be feeding them, unfortunately. And it can even be healthy sugars, unfortunately, if you're having a lot of them. So reducing sugar in your diet is absolutely key. And I know that's easier said than done. And it's just, if you focus mainly on reducing those more processed foods which contain sugar. And I am so surprised when you look at a snack bar and it says natural on the front of it. And if you go to the back of the packet, a lot of the time when you read the amount of sugar in these things, I can't believe it. It can be like 15 grams of sugar in one bar. And you might have been buying it because you were making a health conscious decision. It looks like a healthy food, so just be mindful of that as well. But removing those processed foods and even the refined carbs like the white rice and pasta. When you are consuming those in high amounts, that can feed the bacteria. Some of the more processed fats as well, like the trans fats and the fats that we'll find in processed foods, can become an issue as well. Alcohol can cause issues in the gut and feed the bacteria. So it's probably all the things that we know about for the most part. And I take the approach with my clients is that we try and do as much as we can on a routine basis. And then if you're going out with friends or, there's things happening and you have a dessert, it's not the end of the world, but it's the things that you're doing on a daily basis that make the biggest difference. So they're the foods that probably aren't so helpful. And then with some of my clients, they will have certain reactions to food, or they might have gluten sensitivity, they might have issues with dairy, soy, eggs. These are kind of the ones that I see the most in my clinic. And there are various ways that we can look into that and decide whether that's an issue for them. There's testing, but there's also a process that you can go through to give you a bit more insight whether you are reacting to certain foods. And then when it comes to foods that are going to feed the gut bacteria, the healthy gut bacteria that you want to thrive, you can bring in polyphenols. So the gut bacteria absolutely loves these antioxidants that are found in a lot of plant-based foods for the most part. And you find them in dark berries and leafy greens and all those foods that have a pigment. And eating different colored foods is a good idea because each pigment in a food has a different benefit when it comes to your health. This is all about eating the rainbow. And as a rule of thumb, when I'm making a plate of food, I'm aiming for 3 different colors on my plate. So I know that I've got a good variety there, because what can happen is we might love blueberries and then suddenly we're eating a massive handful of blueberries every day. And I can see that sometimes on the results, because they have a huge growth of something called Akkermansia, which really feeds on polyphenols. And then the bacteria that feed on fiber, for example, are very, very low. So that's the other part of this, high fiber foods, which I don't think people are still, I don't think we're talking enough about fiber. I get, clients will come to me, so how much fats, carbohydrate, and protein do I need? I'm like, that's not how I look at it. I look at it as fiber rather than carbohydrate. How much fiber are you eating in your diet? I mean, there are various foods that have a lot of fiber in them, like the root vegetables, especially with the skin on. You can just cook a big batch of root vegetables and have them in your fridge, and you can put them into salads and things. I love quinoa, wild rice, buckwheat. I mean, I'm gluten-free, so I go for all the gluten-free grains. But I use these a lot with my clients as well, as they're full of fiber, chia seeds, flax seeds. They are all going to give you a lot of fiber, and they're going to feed the beneficial gut bacteria as well. And then you also have the prebiotic type foods. So these foods that have been shown to really help to feed the gut bacteria based on their fiber content for the most part, like Jerusalem artichoke, garlic, asparagus, ginger. Garlic and ginger are great as well because they're antimicrobial. So they're going to help to kill off some of these unhelpful bacteria that you have in the gut as well. And then there's the fermented foods like the sauerkraut, the kimchi, the kefir. With those, especially with my clients, because they are quite sensitive and reactive, especially when we start working together, fermented foods is sometimes just too much for their system because they do have a lot of bacteria in them. That's the whole point of eating them. They're beneficial bacteria, but if your gut is already completely imbalanced and you already have a high growth of a lot of bacteria because your immune system is suppressed, actually adding more fermented foods can do more harm than good. So that's why I will recommend bringing in fermented foods later on in the process. And that went for me as well. I remember I was working on my gut. I was feeling really great at this point, and my fatigue was so much better. My psoriasis had gone, my hair had grown back. And then I had some kombucha and I came up in hives all over my body, which I was just about to go on holiday. And it took a week really for everything to calm down. But it was just too much for my system at that moment in time. And I didn't see it as, oh gosh, I've gone I've gone backwards, because it's all part of the journey. And with an autoimmune condition, you can progress really far, but then something happens and you kind of go backwards a little bit, and then you start rebuilding again. But it's taken me a long time to get to the point where I can now have sauerkraut and not have a reaction. I can have kefir, but you don't need loads of it, but it is good to include it once your body is able to tolerate it.
Mm. And I guess too, it's remembering, that your body changes over time, your gut will change with you, your hormones change. So what worked for you, a couple of years ago may not work for you right now. And it's just having that awareness of that. And like you said, you try the kombucha and it doesn't, didn't work that time, but maybe a year or two down the track, it may.
Yeah, exactly. And that is the thing. I get my clients to a position, and I've got myself to a position where you are feeling loads better, you've reversed a lot of your symptoms, but you have to maintain your health. I've just got a food sensitivity test that I'm going to be doing today, and I've ordered another test which is going to check like my thyroid levels. It's something I have to stay on top of, and that's not a bad thing. I actually really enjoy a lot of the things I'm doing and I feel good for it, but things can change in your life. You can go through grief, you can have changes in your job, you might move. All these things are going to impact your health. But all I say to my clients, especially when people have had hair loss or they're concerned about some of the symptoms coming back, they get very worried about it. And it's that I always say, have the belief you've turned this around once before. Even if something happened, let's hope it doesn't, but even if something happened, you know what to do now. You're stronger than you were then. Just have faith that you know that your body can heal. And one of my favorite mantras is that my body has the most amazing ability to heal. So every time, if anything happens to me, if I get ill, I got the flu unfortunately in December, and I just always think that my body has this amazing ability to heal, and it really does. When you give it the right things, it's amazing what it can do.
Well, the human body, it's so resilient too. Like you can throw so many things at it for such a long period of time, and then, like you said, you can change things, start changing your diet, even just small changes. And you can see the flow on effects maybe in your gut or, how regularly you go to the toilet. Those effects come through fairly quickly, in a matter of days.
Yeah, they really do. Yeah, it is. Honestly, I sometimes see some clients, especially when they're not eating the greatest diet and not looking after themselves, and they start making the changes. It's phenomenal, like the results they see in a short period of time.
Mm. And where do you sort of hope like the future of autoimmunity is heading, whether or not sort of in the research field or the treatment sort of side of it with patients and clients?
I would hope there is more research from a medical perspective as well. I think there are some conditions which are more severe and need more medical intervention, and I would love more research into that. I mean, I've looked into that myself when I was looking at doing further studies, and I do find that side of it interesting, but I would like there to be, that I would like there to be more research around kind of the impact of nutrition, because I've become obsessed with so many things in my own health, but also with my clients' health and my brother's health. So, for example, understanding vitamin B12 in a bit more detail, and how that is impacting the body and what that means. And I'd love to get to a point where we're building a picture with every client, whether from a medical perspective or working with a functional medicine practitioner, where we look at the genetics, we look at what's going on in the gut, and hopefully AI will be able to help with this as well. We can bring that together, and then we can make decisions about that client from, as I said, from a natural perspective, from a medical perspective, about what's going to be right for them, because not all medication is going to be right for them, and not all the therapeutic approaches are going to be right for them. But once you know somebody's genetics and you know what's going on in the gut and potentially what's going on with their cellular health, you get such an amazing picture, and you can really personalize the approach. It's what I attempt to do daily in my clinic, but there's so much research needed. But I think AI could transform that, in the sense that we're going to know so much more about the effects of genes. And even when it comes to medication, there are certain genes which we already know certain medication doesn't work for, but people are still given it because it's just given to everyone. But I think in the next 10 years that's going to change, and that could be huge. And sorry, the main thing really is to be more preventative. So can we do testing to understand whether we are susceptible to these conditions, what we can do before they get to the point that we have these symptoms, which for some people unfortunately aren't reversible. A lot of people's symptoms are, but some people's aren't. So being preventative and getting ahead of it makes such a difference. And then you can make all these changes, and people are far more motivated when they know these things, and it's not scaremongering. It's just having that information, and then there is something you can do. So yeah, I think there's a long way to go, but I already see such a shift in the last 20 years. So I'm confident with the right approach, we can make big changes. And yeah, the reason I got into this is because I always wanted to find a cure for autoimmune disease. And I realized from studying it, maybe I'm not going to find a cure, but what I'd love to be able to do is to know how to help somebody to completely reverse their symptoms and to never have another flare, which in a sense is a cure, but we can never say that about an autoimmune condition.
Well, that's kind of good to know, because that was one of my questions, whether or not they do use the word, cure, or is it more that, you're not having any flare-ups. And so if you're not having any flare-ups, it's, for a better word, dormant as such.
Yeah, people use different words, dormant. I use symptom free. Some people use remission. So yeah, that's where I'm aiming to get my clients to. And even knowing the symptoms that you get before a flare can be huge. So if, for me, my wrist, especially before I'm getting ill, or my wrist just might feel a little bit sore again. And I'm like, something's off here. So then I think about what I've been eating, what I've been doing. Have I been working too much? Have I been overtraining? Is something bothering me? So I just have that reflection, and knowing your little signs can be extremely powerful when it comes to managing your health and staying flare free, as I call it, because then you can be really proactive with everything.
And that's it, isn't it? If you can get out in front of it, be proactive, but then also have the, option of being preventative too, then, you're going to be so much better off in the long run.
Yeah, 100%.
Now, before we wrap up, I always love to ask my guests as a final question, if there is one piece of advice that you could give to our listeners that after listening to this podcast, they could just go out and instigate it straight away, what would it be?
Gosh, there's lots of things, but one of the things that my clients always come back to me and they're like, oh, that's made a big difference, is about getting outside in the morning. It's a simple thing, because as I said, actually a lot of the time we just need to go back to some simple habits that can make a big difference. And a lot of people will get up, this is what I used to do, get up in a rush, chaotic, getting out the house, or actually just getting straight to your desk. But going outside, if you can, in bare feet, I know it depends on the time of year. It's lovely to do it in the summertime and the springtime, but you can just wrap up, have a bench outside. You can do it in the wintertime as well. But get outside if you can. Have your feet on the earth, and have a cup of tea, and just get that sunlight. And also just a couple of minutes to just regulate your nervous system. And I think a cup of tea is, I don't know, there's something so nourishing about a cup of tea for me anyway. If you can do that for 5 to 15 minutes in a morning, every morning, one, you're getting your circadian rhythm going. So that's going to help with your sleep. But also you're going to start your day in a calm state. And when we start our day like that, often the rest of our day feels like that. But when we're starting off in more of a chaotic state, it for me anyway, but just the whole day doesn't seem to go right, and I don't quite feel right as a result of that. But if you can start your day with that, you're doing multiple things just by doing that. And I would even say, if you can get up just 5-10 minutes earlier, just so you can do that, it can make a big difference, even though it is, making sure that you're getting plenty of sleep is important too. But yeah, so try that, a couple of days in a row and see how you feel, and see if that makes a difference. And hopefully it will do.
Well, sounds much nicer than kind of getting up and picking up your phone and looking at emails and then getting stressed first thing before you've even, gotten moving for the day.
Yeah, just a bit of calmness, stillness, but at the same time getting that light in as well.
Amazing. So, where can listeners reach out and find your work and connect with you?
So there's a couple of places. I have my own podcast, The Autoimmune Reset. So if you would like to learn more about autoimmune conditions or any tips that I have, then feel free to pop over there. I also have a free group called the Autoimmune Forum, and people can find that on Facebook or going to www.theautoimmuneforum.com. And we've got just a great community over there. I'm sharing lots of information over on that group as well. And then lastly, if you want to download my free resources, find out more about what I do, then you can go to my website, which is www.theautoimmunitynutritionist.com.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing your amazing wisdom with everyone. It's been a real pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kate. I've really enjoyed it.